Well, look, thank you for having me today. I'm really excited to talk to you, and I just want to say like it's been really great getting to hear from Anna and Anu about the what's going on in China and the content design growth there. And you probably know that they wrote this very long and detailed piece for us, and it was just really fascinating to hear about everything that's happening in the industry there. And it's just great to talk to you. So I'm really excited about learning about different markets and different industries around the world where content design is changing and growing, because it's not the same everywhere. And so, yeah, just really grateful and thankful for you inviting me today. And yeah, hopefully we'll have a good chat. So I'm really excited to talk to you today about uh I guess a little bit of a I'm going to call it a philosophy or an approach, or some thoughts about the future of content design and where we're going, because I think we have reached a really interesting time in the industry, and it's been marked by the release of new technologies, but also the maturity in the industry. It's UX writing, content design. It's no longer the new kid, in UX. It's been around for a while. It's matured, and there's a lot going on. So I think it's also time for us to maybe adapt a little bit of our thinking about what's happening. And so that's what I attempted to do with this. I actually presented this earlier this year, but it's been good to see, or at least good to me to see, some of the things that I described earlier this year start to come to fruition, start to come true. So that's always good to see rather than proving me wrong, I guess. So I'll get into it. So where are we? So the industry, and I'm talking globally here. Obviously, there are differences around the world. Experienced a pretty massive period of growth in the second half of the 2010s, and then a little bit of a retraction after COVID hit, and there were a significant amount of layoffs around the world. And what else is happening? So, new technology, particularly language models, are demanding some pretty significant change and adaptation. And as a result, new types of jobs are appearing. We're seeing content designers getting involved with training for AI models and structured content for to support those types of models, and that's really exciting. And at the same time, it isn't just content design. UX as a whole is changing. So I'd say that even though Figma has been around for, a little bit now, it's really in the past, say, 4 years since COVID that I think a tool like Figma has really exploded and made the UX process much more democratic, certainly much more accessible. And with that accessibility becomes changing expectations and perhaps, I guess, a raising of the floor for skills that we're seeing. So, all in all, we're seeing a range of different things happening. And as I thought about this, and I thought about the history of content design and content strategy, well, I didn't really try to, but it appeared to me that there were a couple of distinct phases. And the first phase that I like to call phase one, you can really call it so whatever you like, really encompasses the creation of the World Wide Web, all through up to, say, 2008. And this encompasses, say, the introduction of early web content principles, so information architecture, the development of web content strategy, uh, the development of help and support, technical documentation, particularly self-serve models for support that became much more popular within software. We saw the advent of protocols for the way the web works, HTML, and certainly, methods for editing UI strings like XML. And some of the definitive texts, I might say, of this time were things like information architecture for the web, or managing enterprise content, content critical, what is content strategy and why should you care? It's interesting. At this time, the term content strategy hadn't really taken off. If you speak to people who were involved in content at the time, let's say the 90s or early 2000s, a lot of them called themselves information architects because the we make the distinction now between information architecture and content. At the time, those terms are sort of like bundled up together. So that's really what I think defines this era. And then I think we see a pretty distinct shift into the second phase, and that's really brought on by the introduction of the smartphone. And so it's not the only thing that defines it, but we certainly start to see a maturing of the industry at this point. And that's where you start to see the term content strategy become a lot more popular. And so the first content strategy conference occurs in 2009. Facebook hires the first content strategist around the same time. You've got the advent of mobile, the creation of the term content design, which actually comes a few years later. You have the rise of UX writing as a term, particularly with the rise of mobile design. And you see this shift from content strategist to content designer, particularly in the latter half of the 2010s. You see companies like Shopify and Facebook making announcements that, oh, we're changing from content strategists to content designers. And so you see that shift happening. So some some foundational texts, I would say, for this point are things like content strategy for the web, the elements of content strategy, the gov.uk website, which of course was the place where a lot of content design principles were established, and the content strategy toolkit, Megan Casey's publication. These are, I think, foundational texts for this sort of phase. And it's really defined by growth. We're seeing a growth and maturing of the industry. And now I think we've reached a new phase. I think we are now in a new phase, which I'm calling Content Design 3.0. It's a bit of a stupid name, but you sort of have to name these things. And I think we are entering a new phase. But before we talk about that, I just want to say that these phases aren't really defined by any type of changing of key principles or best practices. Those stay the same all the time through all of these phases. Providing the best content to the user at the right time, that always matters. And so I'd say that these phases are not really defined by different types of software or tools. They are defined by maybe a change in the type of mindset or the type of skills you might need in order to provide those best practices. But those best practices never really change, which should provide us with a little bit of comfort. It means that there will always be content required. So I think, why should we care really? And so we're entering a new phase of content design. Why does this matter? I think it matters because the technologies we're seeing are having such a huge impact. So language models have emerged and they've become obviously the talk of the town, so to speak. Now, a lot of that initial hype cycle has worn off, but language models are now being integrated into major products in significant ways, and so we need to work with those. Job descriptions are now consistently requiring skills that were previously only required in UX designers, but are now required of content designers and UX writers. I'm particularly thinking of things like research, where that wasn't necessarily expected before. It's more expected now. So the bar has risen. And now content designers are specifically involved with the development of era-defining technology. I am thinking about language models there, but I'm also thinking about things like dynamic systems, like content systems, and so on, which we'll talk about in a second. Now, I have to warn you all, this is just my opinion. This is just one person's opinion. I'm not necessarily saying this is gospel. This is just a way I've liked to organize my thoughts. And the way I see it now, this era of content design that we're in is defined by five things. The first is a focus on dynamic systems over static deliverables. The second is democratized content creation. The third is development and guidance of era-defining technology. The fourth is content as part of general design leadership. And the fifth is an increased focus on specialist topics. And so these are the five principles that I think are defining this shift we've found ourselves in. So again, I just want to reiterate, none of this changes the foundational principles of UX systems or content. Best practices are best practices, always. Just how we approach them changes. So let's start with this first principle, a focus on dynamic systems over static deliverables. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that previously, and even still, a lot of the focus for content designers and UX writers has been on writing individual strings for a design. So, here's your here's your onboarding flow, and you're working creating the pieces of text in that system, in that flow, and that's your role. Now, that will continue to be the role of content designers, but I think it is also going to be joined by a focus and a requirement for content designers to create systems that either govern the creation of that content dynamically or is actually generating that content, perhaps through an AI system, perhaps not. So what I would say is that and this is also coming alongside a need for content designers to think less about the individual screens they're working on and more about the product as a whole. And that's coming because, as I mentioned before, in the job descriptions we see, the bar has risen, so we're being asked to do things that UX designers were asked to do, research and so on. We're also being asked to think more about the product ecosystem in which we find ourselves and not just limit ourselves to, say, the screens in front of us. So in other words, we're moving to an environment where we focus less on those strings. We still do focus on those, but we also focus on the parameters to shape those outputs. Now, how is this happening? We've always had guidelines, we've always had style guides, we've always had those types of parameters. The difference now is that the execution of writing is now scalable. So you are now able to use a tool, perhaps driven by a language model, to create more content at once than you could before. Now, this also means that within the context of a product is able to deliver more content to the user more than ever before. And previously, we were sort of standing at the gates of content creation, and those gates no longer really exist. But what does exist is our ability to manage them, right? So I'm not saying this is definitely where this is going to go, but think about things like extreme personalization, right? So I don't know if this will happen now or ever, but imagine a scenario where UI strings are dynamically generated and personalized for each user. Um, so who guides the creation of those strings? Who guides the creation and who guides the syntax? Who guides the conversational flow? Who guides how that sounds? That's going to be the realm of content designers. And we're actually already seeing this. So I've spoken to a lot of people who are, say, working on language models at Google, at OpenAI, and you see conversation designers working hand in hand with engineers and content designers to really guide how these systems work. So that means they're training the models, they're structuring the content, they're making sure that there are rules in place for dynamic content to operate not just at scale, but in high quality. So that also means that content professionals you need to focus on systems and systems thinking instead of just individual effort. Individual effort and working on individual strings will still always happen. But you need to be focused, I think, much more on scale and maintaining quality at scale than before. So that's the big first principle. Um, Jad says in the chat, so instead of being the ferryman carrying content we manufacture, we are becoming more like gatekeepers to make sure the content passes through the portal of the system seamlessly. Yeah, I'd say that's pretty close. So I'd say that that's pretty close to what I'm saying. Now, of course, you will still again be working on those individual strings. I just think that this is becoming much more of an important part of your overall thinking. So, principle number two, um, democratized content creation. And I saw your question, and I'm going to get back to that right after the chat because I think there's some things in here that I can address to that question. So, democratized content creation. So, everyone could always write content before, but not necessarily easily, right? So, there were at least some gates to continue using that metaphor for content creation. Now, content is democratized through the use of generative technology, but not just generative technology. I don't want to just say that this is all happening because of language models. It's happening because of, as I mentioned before, the rise of tools like Figma. It's much easier to get into a design now and start working with content. Tools like Ditto or Frontitude, where systems, again, that's systems thinking, are guiding how content is created, means it's much easier for a UX designer to create some content that's in line with a style guide than they did before because they're being guided by those types of tools. So again, this is happening through the things I just mentioned, but also through connecting with individual applications and features to design systems. So more people have access to easy content creation that's in style, as in your organization style, I mean. So what does that mean and where is this going? So that means that speed now becomes a business variable more so than before. So if your competitors can create good content faster, then they are always going to come out ahead. Um, it's interesting in the podcast that Anna and Anu were on, we talked about that and how there's this just in incessant need for speed in some corners of the content design market. And I think this speaks to that. If your competitors are able to create not just content, but quality content at scale, you need to be able to meet that. So, what does that mean? It means that you need to make sure that everyone in your organization who can create content or is creating content is doing so in a way that maintains the quality of your style. It means that you shouldn't necessarily be thinking, well, I don't want all of these other people in the organization creating content. What we should be doing is empowering people to create content. Where we come in as content designers is making sure that that content is quality and it upholds our standards. So we shouldn't necessarily be having the attitude of, oh, well, I'm the writer, I'm the content designer. This is what I'm going to do, and no one else can. You are the content designer. That's your specialty, but you should be inviting people into the process. And so I think we're going to see much more of that. Um, I'm gonna pick up the pace a little because I don't want to go too long into Q&A. Third principle for content design 3.0 is the development and guidance of era-defining technology. So it's been really interesting to see content designers working on and having some pretty significant influence on language models. And that's what I'm talking about here. So we aren't just at the whims of this technology. We're actually involved in it. So we're seeing that through the creation of roles at Google, OpenAI. Anthropic is currently hiring for a content designer. I've spoken to the people who are working on these models, and content designers are fully involved. They're working hand in hand, not just to guide the use of, let's say, all-purpose chatbots, right? But what we're seeing now is that organizations implementing these language models need content professionals to train the models, to create new content, to structure that content appropriately. Think back to, information architecture again. It's the same practices coming up again and again. So there's a huge need for content professionals in working in these, especially because we are now seeing a move away from, say, those all-purpose models like ChatGPT or Claude and so on. We're now seeing companies like Apple, the way they're introducing AI is having it sit under the hood powering features. And they're not necessarily going to call it AI, but they will be powered by language models. And so I think that the structure and scaffolding of content is now much more important than ever because more organizations are going to say, how can we implement AI and how can we use AI to our advantage? The answer to that is through content and making sure that content is structured appropriately. So that's the third principle that I'm seeing. And I've seen that more and more this year. More people and content designers getting involved in the creation and the guidance of those models. The fourth principle is content as part of general design leadership. So, something that I think has been really great is to see content designers maturing into general design leadership roles. So, previously, or until quite recently, if you wanted to be the head of design, the types of people who would usually get that job were people who had been UX designers, or product designers. We are now starting to see examples of content designers moving into generalized design leadership. So content design becomes a pathway to leading design overall, which is fantastic because it means that there's career growth. And it also means that content can have an influence in overall design. So we're seeing this happen because content leaders have influenced enough organizations to establish guidance and leadership over entire departments. And as a result, that means we're going to see content knowledge and experience influence that design. So that there are tracks to leadership, and that's just a really great thing because it means that there's opportunity and there's something to look up to, and that's a great pathway. So of course, I wouldn't say a caveat, but there's a byproduct of this. And the byproduct is that content departments and professionals will now expect more of intermediate and junior content designers. That's partly due to the growth in leadership. That's also partly due to the fact that the discipline has matured. So just in general, we're no longer sort of the new kid. We're established. We're here. If you'll notice, perhaps at some conferences, you may start to see less of the why UX writing and content design is important type of articles, and now moving into more complex topics. Those articles and talks are great. I think they should be done, but we're now maturing and we're seeing the more maturity with that, which is exciting. And then finally, the fifth principle I'm seeing is that there's an increased focus on specialist topics. So especially this year, now this may just be due to the fact that we've seen a retraction since COVID, but I actually don't think so. What we're seeing is more companies are hiring content designers across specialist teams and functions. So if you look at all the jobs that are available right now, a large portion of them are for very specific teams, like the growth team or the sales team or the interaction team or the ads team and so on. There are fewer and fewer sort of all-purpose content design roles. And I think that's not just because there's been a distinct focus on growth and proving impact. It also means that there's just going to be less of a generalist position for content designers. And so what that means is that I think developing a niche and a specialization is going to be much more important. And success in those areas is dependent on demonstrating impact. So I would say the more that you can focus on a particular specialty, such as maybe it's testing, maybe it's rapid growth, those types of areas where you can develop a focus, I think will largely benefit you. And I think that's because I, and again, this is just my opinion, we've seen organizations get the most benefit out of content design when it's attached to very specific things that are measurable and trackable, rather than just say, hey, an all-purpose content designer. Don't get me wrong, those roles will and should still exist, but I think they will increasingly become on par with the number of specialist content design roles out there. So the real question is like, if that's happening, how can we adapt? And the good news is that a lot of the skills you need to succeed in this era are the same that have always been there. So, for example, when we're talking about dynamic systems over static deliverables, what we're really talking about there are things like style guides, print style principles, things like information architecture, understanding technical foundations. Th Those types of things have always been in demand, and they will help you there. For things like democratized content creation, again, design systems, dynamic content rules, learning how language models work. For things like the development and guidance of era-defining technology, yeah, learning how language models work is really great. What's really important is understanding structured content. So understanding how should content be structured? What type of metadata should you have in that content? Should you be using a system like Data or something else? Should you be on so basically just trying to understand how content should be structured for your organization. I've put Python there just because I think it's fun to mess around with language models and do some cool things with them, but you certainly don't have to. I would say what's more important is understanding whenever you see a language model in any type of product, you should always be thinking, what's the content that this is trained on? Who organized that content? Who wrote it? Who maintains it? That should be the realm of a content designer. In terms of content as part of general design leadership, proving impact is a big thing. So testing and research, and also strategic thinking, systems thinking. Don't just think about content design. Think about the entire organization as a whole and how content integrates with product. And then finally, an increased focus on specialist topics. I would say things like conversation design and particularly growth teams. So rapid testing, expansion, understanding how products scale. Those types of principles are really key to understanding and becoming in demand there. So that's basically my thoughts on Content Design 3.0. What I'd just say finally is that change is always going to happen in this industry. Change happens rapidly. The important thing is that content is important. Like content fills all of our experiences, and someone needs to create it. And whether that's us or whether that's a language model, someone needs to be guiding some content somewhere. So the good news is we'll all have jobs, hopefully. The hiring this year there was a lot of thinking that maybe, oh, the jobs would sort of cool off now that language models are here. That hasn't been the case this year. There's been a lot of hiring. A lot of the people who were looking for work in 22, 23 are now in some pretty significant roles, which is great. And nothing here is new. No, we're facing new types of challenges, but the tools we use to address those challenges the skills that we've always had. So what I would say is just get involved, learn as much as you can. You're all doing great by attending these types of meetups, which is fantastic. Um, but don't rely on yourself to learn as well. Like join as many communities as you can, talk to others, share blog posts, come to meetups like these. I think to me, it's like this is a very optimistic time for content design. So I hope this has been optimistic for you. So those are my thoughts. I'm happy to answer a couple of questions. In fact, we have some in the chat now. Anna, do you mind if I just go ahead and start answering these at will? Is that okay with you both, Anna and I? Okay, great. Um, so actually, Anna, I'll ask you first because you asked this question. How can content designers join the conversation with developers and product managers in order to maintain quality at scale? Yeah, great question. So I think, like anything, it always starts with relationship, right? So I like to understand before I even start talking about technical solutions. To me, it's easier to get something done and come to an agreement when you know the people to whom you're requesting something or from whom you're requesting something. So I like to understand, like, what are their biggest requirements? Like, what is the organization requiring of them? What are the demands on them? Is it speed? Is it delivery? What's really driving them and what are their motivations? The more I understand that, the more you can enter a conversation with them and then start talking about the real thing you want, which is maintaining that quality at scale. And I like just to put things on the table and just say, listen, my key motivation, I don't want to stop you from creating content, right? What I want to do is make sure that the content is the highest quality possible. And I think starting the conversation there and not closing the gates to content it enables that conversation to start. From there, what you can start, and it obviously depends on individual circumstance, but what I would say is start the conversation by saying, what's the fastest way we can introduce quality checks to the content? Is that the develop is it an automated style tool like Frontitude? Is it a checklist or something that we can give to developers and PMs if they want to write content? I would sort of approach the conversation with that intention and not just closing things off and saying, "Oh, I'm the only one who can write content because I'm the writer." Instead, focus it more on like the quality thing, and you can act as the checker. You can act as the quality check on whatever's being written. And what I always like to, and I like to go with examples, and I like to if the develop. I remember at MYOB where I was for several years. I had to sit down with some people because they were writing text and it wasn't I don't want to say it wasn't good, but it certainly wasn't as good as it could have been. And so I sat down with them and I said, "Hey, would you be, thank you so much for like contributing some strings. Would you be open to some feedback about these strings you've written?" And they said yes. And I showed them, I was like, so we've got your string here. And I showed them a different one. And I was like, and I just pointed out the differences. Like, what do you think the difference is between these two strings? And it's so hard. You have to do this in a non-condescending way. But like, you have to just say, like, what do you think the difference is? I've chosen this string because of X, Y, and Z. And once you point out, they go like, oh yeah, okay, I understand that. So like just things like that, I think can aim to educate rather than gatekeep. That's a very long-winded way of answering your question, but I hope that helps. Um, Jared asks, do you think that AI will be able to help enforce these standards as well as to help scale the impact these guidelines and standards set? Or is it still too far a gap in trusting AI to really check and correct? I would say it depends, and it depends on the tool that you're using. So I like to say that the more focused the tool, the better results you're going to get. So I would not rely on something like ChatGPT or Claude to be doing something like this because they're all purpose. But if you're using something like Frontitude, which has that type of ability built into it, where you can power it with your own style guidelines, or and this isn't available to everyone, but a tool like Writer, which is designed to do that, then I think that is very much something that AI can do. But again, I think they tend to have to be a little bit more focused and custom built rather than just sticking something in ChatGPT or whatever and then just going nuts. So the more focused, the better, I think. Arnie says, how do you foresee content designers ensuring consistent quality in content when it's being generated dynamically at scale? Are there potential downsides to this shift? Yeah, so great question. Before I even answer this question, and I'm sorry to do like a shill, but I'd encourage everyone, if you are interested in this topic, I interviewed someone at Monday.com who is doing exactly this. Ron Yakar at Monday.com. He used Frontitude to create basically a style checker that allows his designers to create strings in style. And he's able to use that to help create content across, the 20 different designers that he's helping. So, uh, in terms of are they able, how do you foresee ensuring consistent quality? Those types of tools are one way of doing it, but also making sure the guidelines are not only robust, but making sure that they're implemented in a way that, again, in a focused tool and not just relying, and I would say, not just relying on them to do it sort of like on their own. So it isn't just about saying, here's a rubric, here's a list of rules, go nuts. It's about putting sort of guidelines and checks and balances in place, like an automated tool like Frontitude, to make sure that it's consistent in quality. But again, making sure it's as robust as possible, but also training, training everyone in what makes a decent string. Like what makes good UX content? Bringing everyone up to a baseline. It's been really interesting. We've done a lot of workshops through UX Content Collective to entire teams. So we'll get an entire team coming in, and you might have a couple of content designers, a product manager, some developers. And it's been really interesting seeing the reactions from, say, the developers, because they'll go like, "Oh, wow, I didn't really even know about concepts like progressive disclosure." Maybe they did in terms of like they see it all the time, but they didn't really recognize it, and they didn't really understand about a principle of, say, empathy and like ensuring that the string should match the user. It shouldn't evoke emotion. Just things like that. And so I think bringing everyone up to a baseline, and you can all do that yourselves. Like you're smart, like you're all, equipped and qualified. You can lead a workshop on, UX writing in your organization. So I think that is something in terms of potential downsides. Yes. If you're creating so much content that you can't possibly check it, I think that there's a downside there. So you need to make sure the process is robust. Um, what kind of content specialists currently in demand based on your experience? I think because language models are so big, people who are have been working with them on their own. So it's too new to be asking content designers, "Oh, you need 5 years of experience, in a language model." It's just not realistic. But there are a lot of job ads at the minute where they're asking familiarity with AI. So basically, they're asking you, have you started playing with these types of tools on your own? Um, Not only that, but also UX research and testing. So both qualitative and quantitative methods, seeing much more of that in job ads. In terms of what core skills should they focus on developing to stay relevant as this shift occurs? Structured content. To me, that is the big thing. So, how do you make sure that content is structured well enough so that if an organization wants to make use of it, it can structured content, but also the same UX principles as always. Providing the right content to the user at the right time. It's been really interesting because let's be honest, like most people in content design roles are not necessarily going to be working on the integration of language models. What may happen and is much more likely to happen, and we're seeing that happen more, is those content designers will be working on strings for product features that are powered by AI. And so they are needing to create and come up with language to describe AI powered features. And they're having to give information to the user about, hey, this was automated by this product, double check it. And so it's been really interesting talking about these scenarios because everyone thought, oh, the language models are coming in and then the jobs will disappear. What's happened is that as products are integrating these models into their ecosystems, they're creating pretty significant design challenges, not just in the technical side, but also how to tell the user, how does this work? You know, educating them on what happens when it doesn't work. And so that's all the realm of the content designer. So in terms of staying relevant, I just think like basic UX foundations are good. But also learn how language models work, structured content, and again, particularly testing, because there is a higher expectation now that you are able to demonstrate impact in your work. Casper asks, you mentioned the intersection between LLMs and information architecture. Could you elaborate more on this, please? So yes. So what I mean is that under any LLM integration, there is content, and that content needs to be structured for that language model to be trained in order to perform a task. So I'll give an example for something we've used in UX Content Collective because that's the one I'm most familiar with. So, and that's something I've done hands-on. So we created what we call a live search in our Fundamentals of UX Writing course, where we took our entire course with some supplementary material and we trained it within a custom bot powered by GPT to answer questions that the user has about where certain things are in the course. So that a user need that we've had for a long time is a core search. People really want to find information. Maybe they go away for 3 months, come back, and they want to pick up, but they can't remember where certain things are in the course. So they might ask, where do you talk about content testing, for instance? And so we wanted to train our bot on that so it can say, it's in lesson 4.3, here are some principles, blah, 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 but not just from general GPT training, from our material. So initially, my approach was, well, let's just take the course and stick it in a document and train the bot and see how it goes, right? Doesn't work. It's much too much content. What you end up having to do is splitting everything into multiple pieces of content. And what you also then have to do is also make sure that each of those individual pieces of content has metadata, has a summary, has Q&A, so the bot can learn what's a good answer, what's a bad answer. And in that way, what we're talking about really is structure. And what is information architecture if not structure? So it's that type of same thinking that goes into training a model. So that's what I mean between the intersection of language models and information architecture. Again, whenever you see some type of model being integrated like that, you should be thinking, what is the structured content that's underpinning this experience? The best example is something like a help center. If you have a chatbot attached to a help center, what's it getting answers from? It's getting answers from the support articles that are written. You know, if you're providing a bot with to a user, that bot is going to be powered by content somewhere, and that content needs to be structured well. When I mentioned Apple before, what I meant to say there was that instead of uh, like all-purpose chatbots like ChatGPT or Claude, which are still, used and widely used, what we're seeing more is companies integrating language models in specific features. A really great example is Zapier. I don't know if anyone here has used Zapier, but it's a site where you can connect two applications together. So, if I get an email, make a row in Google Sheets or whatever. And you used to have to pick from like drop downs or search for whatever you want. Now, if you go to Zapier.com, you just type in what you want to have happen, and then it takes that, interprets it, and then provides you a recommended connection between two apps. A language model is involved there, but it doesn't say like AI. It doesn't say, oh, we're using a language model. It's just built into the product base. And so that's what I mean there. So it's less about saying, here's a flashy AI thing. It's more about under the hood. That's what I mean there. Pedro asked, what metrics do you think are important when assessing the performance and quality of content? Really depends on what you're writing and what you're creating and your organization. What I would say is, what metrics do I think are important? What metrics does your organization think are important? And then work backwards from there. So is it revenue? Is it feature completion? Is it new subscribers? Is it something else? So be guided by that. And that is the way you are going to sort of guide your testing. When it comes to sort of general UX and general sort of user experience, there's all the main ones, right? Like being able to complete a task successfully, being able to say, understand the content that's provided to them. One metric that I think is good to measure within testing is, does what the user expect to happen reflected in the actual experience of the product? So if you're in testing and you show someone a screen and you ask them, what do you think happens if you click on this button? And they say, oh, I think it takes me to my credit card screen. Is that accurate or is it false? So that can reveal gaps in your content. But in terms of like specific metrics, I would be guided by what your organization wants. And without that, a good rule of thumb is always money. So whatever provides revenue, either in revenue gained or another way, like time saved and so on. Sabrina asks, or just says, in China, UX writing meets cultural context workshops would probably be the best kind of workshops to organize. That'd be interesting. I'd be interested in reading more about that. Question about content design leadership. Do you think the evolving role of content designers as general UX leaders will shape the way teams are structured? Yeah, it might. I think we might see more opportunities for content professionals in those types of teams. I also think you'll probably start to see more content designers getting who achieve that level of leadership, getting their people trained in content overall. So that is also part of what's leading to that democratized culture of content creation that I mentioned earlier. So some of these principles are sort of like um, there's a symbiotic relationship between a few of them. So as more content design leaders get into leadership, the more people get trained, the higher their expectations, and so on and so on. So I think that is one of the way we'll see the role change. And I also think that the way teams are structured, we're probably going to see smaller, more focused teams in general. But I don't think that's because of content design. I think that's just UX in general. Um, and it says, I guess another skill in demand would be content audit and content maintenance, because before you feed your data to the language model, you'll need to make sure your data is polished and correct. Yeah, everyone forgets maintenance with these things. Everyone forgets that, like, once you have a model, it's not just that you train it once and then it's done. You have to constantly feed it new information, and people need to be involved in that. Um, Okay, we got an interesting question here. So, earlier in the year, we had an idea to explore content hyper personalization within our app. Specifically, we considered tailoring content such as mood and tone of voice based on different user age groups, so Gen Z, millennials, and so on. Before I even read on, I just want to say I'm really glad you did this because I wish apps did this more often. I don't know why we can change our background colors in apps, but we can't change the way our apps speak to us. Anyway, um, however, this approach was challenged with the argument that tone of voice is an intrinsic part of the brand identity and should remain consistent regardless of the user demographic. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this. Do you have any insights or recommendations regarding balancing brand consistency with personalized user experiences? Yeah, well, I mean, I do have experience with that. So when I was at MYAB, we actually did a series of case of what would you call it, working groups, where we attempted to get a baseline understanding of how people reacted to the different tones in our brand voice. So, as you probably know, you have a brand voice that's consistent, that describes your personality, but then you also have the tones within that brand voice that change based on emotion. So, I might describe Arno as like a happy person, right? But that doesn't mean that Anu is going okay, well maybe not all the time. But that doesn't mean that Anu is going to be happy all the time. He's not going to act the same at a wedding as he would at a funeral. He's going to change his approach, right? But that doesn't mean he's a different person. It just means that he's approaching different situations differently. And so what we did with the working groups was we got one group and we gave them content that was all written in one particular tone. And then we gave another group, working group, content that was written in another tone, and a third group, the same thing. And then we got them to read all the content and go through the content. And then we asked them a series of questions. How friendly did you find it out of 10? Like, how trustworthy was it out of 10? And so on. Some tones were more trustworthy, but less interesting, right? Some people said one tone was much more compelling, but they didn't necessarily like trust it all that much. And so there was just an interesting combination of reactions. And so I that's my extent of getting insights. Different groups have different reactions to different tones. What I would say is that, and we'd have to have a full-on conversation about this, but I would, if I was in your shoes, what I would be doing is maybe suggesting a similar sort of thing and just testing with users, and just seeing how they react to it. But in terms of the consistency, I would go back and say, look, our brand voice is consistent, but that doesn't mean we talk the same all the time. And it doesn't mean you talk the same all the time in your existing product. You write an error message in the same way you write a notification, because your users would hate it. So I would almost go back and say, hey, we're doing this now anyway. So let's just do it in a slightly different way. I hope that helps. Um, Sabrina says Kamala Harris' social team is a whole Gen Z campaign, which is completely different than the campaigns from Gen X and millennials. That's interesting. Um, I guess another skill in we talked about the maintenance. There we go. Um, Well, I think that's the end of the questions, unless anyone has any more.
Last call for questions.
Last call.
Speak now or hold your peace forever.
Sorry, I didn't have time to type the message. Anna said that we have to rush. I just want to quickly ask here. Interestingly, Patrick, you mentioned about few adjectives and adverbs here. Is the content friendly, trustworthy, interesting, compelling? Would you happen to have any data set of these sort of words? Because we also have something similar in design. But for content, unfortunately, I haven't checked it yet. Would you have any references by any chance?
I can send you the list that we used, but I actually think it was from somewhere else. Can I email you at your email username?
Sure.
I'm gonna email.
I'll send it over to Anna. No worries. Thank you.
Okay, no worries. Yeah, I'll find it and send it over because the one that we used is probably the one that I would recommend. So I'll send that over to you, to Anna. Any other questions?
Very, very last call for questions. Last question. We'll take one last question. How about that? One last question.
Everyone's talked out.
Yeah, I feel like we had quite an intense discussion in the chat. And yeah, oh my God, that's a great idea. I also I remember one of the just to add up maybe a little bit to the question that Prati was asking just now. I also know of a Chinese company that works in digital payments. So what they did is they literally tested different types of messages on different user groups. So they created different sets of push notifications for different age groups. Again, using the same tone, using different tone of voice, as Patrick was saying, and then they used the performance, the click rate of those push notifications to build an argument with the product team and say, hey, look, we tried a thing in this smaller area and it worked. How about we scale it up? So that's another maybe way for you probably to try it out. Find a small area where you can get clear data outcomes of those content differences, of those differences in tone of voice, and then use this as an argument to further scale this idea with your product team.